In 2012, I spent 2 weeks in the Vatican archives. What I saw there, they never let anyone publish. Spinoza was right about everything, and I'm going to show you the evidence they don't want you to see.
18 years of Jesus' life are simply missing. No gospel explains it. No document mentions it. Spinoza noticed that silence like this is never accidental. It is always managed. Let me be precise about what I mean. The Gospel of Luke ends its account of Jesus' childhood with a single sentence in chapter 2, verse 52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. That is the last thing Luke says about Jesus as a young person. The next time Luke mentions him by name is in chapter 3, when John is baptizing in the Jordan and Jesus comes to be baptized, a man of approximately 30 years of age. Between those two moments, 18 years pass in complete silence. No explanation, no apology for the gap, no acknowledgement that anything has been omitted. Just the boy growing in wisdom and stature, and then the man standing in the river. 18 years of a life, the entirety of a young man's formation, his education, his travels or lack of them, his developing understanding of the tradition he would transform, simply absent from the record. Matthew is no different. Mark never mentions the childhood at all. John opens not with biography but with theology. In the beginning was the Word, and dispenses with human formation entirely. 4 Gospels, 4 different authors, 4 different audiences, 4 different theological agendas. And on this one point, the years between Jesus' childhood and his public ministry, all 4 are in perfect, unanimous, unexplained silence. Spinoza would have found this immediately interesting. Not disturbing, not scandalous, interesting. In the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, which he completed in 1670, Spinoza developed a method of reading scripture that begins with what is absent rather than what is present. He argued with the precision of a man who had been trained in both rabbinical exegesis and Cartesian analysis that the gaps in a text are not neutral. A text is produced by someone, for someone, with a purpose. When a text consistently avoids a subject, when every author who touches the material makes the same omission across different traditions, different literary styles, different theological interests, that shared omission is data. It tells you something about what those authors collectively judged to be unincludable. And what Spinoza found when he applied his method to that silence will take some time to explain, because the explanation requires first understanding the shape of the void itself. There are 3 explanations that have been offered for the 18-year gap. The first is the one the Church has always preferred. The second is the one that a Russian journalist made famous in 1894, and that academics demolished by 1895. The third is the one that most serious New Testament scholars have thought about carefully, and that institutional theology has very little interest in discussing. I'm going to take you through all 3, but I want to start not with an explanation, but with the silence itself, because what I am about to show you changes how you read every gospel. Consider the arithmetic of what we are being asked to accept. The Gospel of Luke dedicates 5 complete chapters to the events surrounding Jesus' birth. The Annunciation to Mary, the journey to Bethlehem, the shepherds, the presentation at the temple, the visit of the wise men in Matthew's parallel account. The infancy narratives are detailed, specific, textured. Luke mentions the swaddling clothes. He mentions the manger. He mentions the angel host, the census under Quirinius, the purification rites at the temple when the child was 8 days old. For approximately 12 months of Jesus' life, Luke provides a level of narrative density that no subsequent period receives. And then, after the single episode at the temple at age 12 that I will return to shortly, the record goes completely dark for 18 years. A text that counted the swaddling clothes did not count the years of formation. When I first registered this, really registered it, not as a familiar scholarly point but as a lived experience of reading, it was in Norwich in the mid-1990s. I was at my desk in the study at the back of the house. It was late, past 11, and the lamp was on because the daylight had been gone for hours. Norfolk in autumn has a particular quality of darkness, not dramatic, just thorough. the kind that settles around 9 o'clock and does not negotiate. I had two texts open simultaneously, something I had done hundreds of times before. The end of Luke chapter 2 and the beginning of Luke chapter 3. I had been preparing something for a graduate seminar, a discussion of the synoptic problem, the relationship between Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the question of shared sources. Nothing about the lost years specifically, just comparative structural analysis of the texts as documents. And then I noticed something I had not consciously noticed before, though it had been there on every reading. Luke chapter 2 ends, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favour with God and man." Luke chapter 3 begins, "Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea." And then John is in the wilderness preaching, and Jesus is arriving at the Jordan to be baptized, and the text gives his age as about 30 years. I sat with those 2 pages open for a long time. The tea on the desk went cold without my noticing. The lamp made its small circle on the table. What I felt was not shock. It was something quieter than that, and in some ways more disorienting. It was the recognition that I had read this text, taught this text, for nearly 20 years, within an institution that trains people to read this text, and I had never, not once, asked the most elementary question available to any reader. Where was he? Not where did the tradition say he went? Not what theological category explained the absence. Simply, where was he for 18 years, and why did no one who wrote these documents think it worth mentioning? The first explanation, the one the institution prefers, is that Jesus spent those 18 years in Nazareth working as a carpenter, living a quiet and humble life that was unremarkable enough to require no documentation. This is the explanation that fits the theology of incarnation. The Son of God emptying himself of divine prerogative and living an ordinary human life, indistinguishable from his neighbors, until the moment of his baptism and public calling. There is a certain elegance to this reading. It sits well with the emphasis in the Synoptic Gospels on Jesus' identification with ordinary people, his willingness to eat with sinners and laborers, his consistent rebuke of religious hierarchy. If he spent 18 years as a craftsman in a small Galilean village, he was one of them before he claimed to speak to them. It is a satisfying explanation. Hold it in mind for a moment, because it is about to become considerably less satisfying. Nazareth in the 1st century was a village of perhaps 200 to 400 people. There is no archaeological evidence of a synagogue there before the 3rd century. It sat approximately 6 kilometers from Sepphoris, a major Hellenistic city that Herod Antipas was actively rebuilding during exactly the years of Jesus' childhood and adolescence. Sepphoris was a cosmopolitan place, Greek-speaking, commercially active, with a theater and a sophisticated urban culture. If a young man from a nearby village was talented, curious, or simply in need of work, Sepphoris was 6 kilometers away. But that is a different story from the one the texts tell, and we will come to it. The more pressing problem with the Nazareth explanation is not geographical, it is textual. There are 3 things that explain the 18-year gap, and the third is the one the church never wanted scholars to find. But before I get to it, I need to show you a document that was not produced in Nazareth. In 1894, a Russian journalist named Nicholas Notovich published a book in Paris titled La vie inconnue de Jésus-Christ, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. He claimed that during a journey to the Himalayas the previous year, he had been shown ancient Buddhist manuscripts at the Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, in what is now northern India. These manuscripts, he said, described a young man called Isa, a Hebraicized name approximating Jesus, who had left Palestine in his early teens, traveled through India and Tibet, studied with Buddhist and Brahmin teachers, and returned to Palestine in his late 20s with a spiritual formation acquired in the East. The book caused a sensation. It was translated into English, German, Italian, Spanish, and multiple other languages. It was reprinted dozens of times. It fed a hunger that had clearly been building since people first noticed, in whatever quiet private moments of reading, that the Gospels simply did not account for 18 years of a life. Here, at last, was an explanation, an adventure, a story of formation. The academic response was rapid and comprehensive. Max Muller, the most eminent Orientalist of his generation, examined the claims and found them insupportable. In 1895, Archibald Douglas, a professor at Government College in Agra, traveled specifically to Hemis Monastery to investigate. He spoke with the abbot and the monks through an interpreter. They had no knowledge of any manuscripts describing Essa. They had no record of Notovich's visit in the form he described. The abbot specifically stated that no European claiming to have a broken leg had stayed at the monastery during that period, which was the story Notovich had used to explain his extended access. The manuscripts, as historical documents, did not exist. This should have been the end of it. It was not. The story has been repeated, embellished, and circulated without interruption for 130 years. Elizabeth Clare Prophet dedicated substantial sections of her 1980s work to the Tibet hypothesis. Levi Dowling's Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ, published in 1911, constructed an elaborate account of Jesus' Eastern travels from what he described as the Akashic record. Every generation has produced its own version. The particulars change. The geographical destination shifts. Sometimes India, sometimes Tibet, sometimes Egypt, sometimes the Druids of Britain. But the underlying structure is always the same. Jesus went somewhere during those 18 years, learned something from a tradition other than the one his later ministry claimed, and the church suppressed the record. Now here is the point that Spinoza would have found more interesting than any specific theory about where Jesus went. The persistence of the demand for this story is itself a datum. For 130 years, in dozens of cultures, across every continent, people have needed to fill those 18 years. The Tibet manuscripts were fabricated. That is not in dispute in any serious academic context. But the hunger that made them credible, that made them a sensation in 1894 and a continuing reference in 2026, is not fabricated. It is a genuine response to a genuine void. Spinoza's observation about popular interpretation applies here with unusual force. What the speculation reveals is not where Jesus went. What it reveals is the shape of the gap that the canonical texts left. And the shape of a gap tells you something about what was removed to create it. In a moment, I will show you the single passage that survived the editing and what it reveals about everything that did not. But first, I need to place the more historically serious alternative, because this is where the argument becomes uncomfortable for anyone who was taught simply to trust the canonical record, not the Tibet manuscripts, something considerably closer to home. I want to take you to a library, not a dramatic location, not the Himalayas, not a monastery, the Bodleian in Oxford. Early in my career, in the early 1990s, I was working on a paper about baptismal rites in Second Temple Judaism, the relationship between the immersion practices attested in the literature of the period and the baptism that John the Baptist was performing at the Jordan. I was working from a microfilm reader in one of the basement reading rooms. The light in those rooms is the particular flat fluorescent white of academic labor. No shadows, no warmth, no suggestion that the outside world exists. You sit in it for hours and emerge blinking like someone who has forgotten the sun. I was reading 1QS, the Rule of the Community, also known as the Community Rule, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947. This document is the governing text of the community that produced it, the community that scholars associate with the site at Khirbet Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, approximately 15 kilometers from the Jordan River. The rule describes in detail the organization of the community, its theology, its ritual practices, and crucially for my purposes that afternoon, its admission procedure for new members. A candidate for membership entered a period of novitiate. The first stage lasted 1 year. At the end of that year, the full community voted on whether to proceed. If accepted, the candidate entered a second stage of 2 years, an extended probationary period involving continued instruction, communal living, and progressive initiation into the community's practices and texts. Only after this 3-year process could a member be considered fully initiated. During that formation period, the novice's property was held in trust, not yet merged with the common fund. The novice ate separately from the full members. The novice was learning, not just doctrine, but a whole way of reading the world. I was comparing the vocabulary of 1QS with the description of John the Baptist's ministry in Mark chapter 1 verse 4, the language of purification, the language of repentance, as a turning, a reorientation of the whole person, the emphasis on communal confession, on ritual immersion as a marker of genuine transformation rather than mere ceremony. The parallels were not incidental. John's location, the Judean wilderness, the Jordan Valley, placed him geographically within 15 kilometers of the Qumran community. His lifestyle, as described in the Gospels, wilderness dwelling, garments of camel hair, a diet of locusts and wild honey, corresponds closely to the ascetic practices described in documents associated with the Essene movement, of which the Qumran community appears to have been one expression. I put down the microfilm spool for a moment and sat with this. I want to be careful about what I am claiming, because the claim is specific and limited. I was not working toward a dramatic revelation. I was following a structural argument in a cold basement room with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside the microfilm reader, and the argument had a shape that I had not quite seen before. If John the Baptist had spent time within or adjacent to the Qumran community, and the geographical, linguistic, and liturgical evidence suggest this as a serious possibility, then John was a product of exactly the kind of extended formation that 1QS describes. 1 year of novitiate, 2 years of deeper formation, 3 years before you arrive at the river already shaped, already with a vocabulary of authority, already knowing what you believe and how to say it. And if that is true of John, then the question of Jesus's 18 missing years acquires a different texture. Because Jesus and John were, according to Luke, relatives. They moved in overlapping circles. Jesus came to John's baptism. The Gospels agree on this. Jesus' ministry in its earliest form bears deep structural and linguistic similarities to the Baptists. The emphasis on repentance, on the coming of the kingdom, on a transformed relationship with the law, these themes are continuous between the two men, which leads to a question that Josephus, writing in the Antiquities of the Jews in the late 1st century, would have considered perfectly reasonable. If the formation that produced John the Baptist required 3 years of structured novitiate in a community of that kind, and if Jesus arrived at the Jordan already formed, already knowing how to speak with authority, already capable of standing before the doctors of the temple at 12 and holding his own, where did that formation occur? Josephus is explicit in his description of the Essenes. In Antiquities Book 18, he writes that they receive children while they are still young and form them according to their own manner. He describes a community that was geographically distributed, not confined to Qumran, but present in various settlements across Judea and Galilee. He describes a community of several thousand people at the time of the 1st century. A young man from a Galilean village, remarkable at 12 for his capacity to engage with the learned men of Jerusalem, would not have been an implausible candidate for the kind of formation that Essene networks offered. None of this is proof. I want to be scrupulous about that. There is no document that says Jesus spent the missing years in an Essene community. There is no manuscript, in Ladakh or anywhere else, that records his travels. What there is instead is a structural observation that Spinoza articulated with some precision in the Tractatus. When a gap in a text is surrounded by evidence that makes a particular explanation coherent, and when the same text consistently avoids the explanation that the surrounding evidence suggests, the avoidance is the data. The four Gospels collectively avoid any account of Jesus' formation. They avoid it with different literary strategies. Matthew and Luke fill the birth period with theology, but skip the formation years. Mark begins at the baptism and skips the entire childhood. John begins before time and skips the entire human developmental arc. 4 authors, 4 strategies. One shared result: Jesus arrives at the Jordan fully formed, with no documented process of formation. And the question that Spinoza would ask, the question that I am asking, is not where did he go? The question is, why did all 4 authors make the same choice? Spinoza never needed the TIBET manuscripts. What he found was already inside the text you have been reading your whole life. And the text that survived, the single fragment that escaped the editorial silence, is worth reading very carefully. Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. The episode at the temple. Jesus is 12 years old. His family has traveled to Jerusalem for Passover. On the return journey, they travel for a full day before realizing that Jesus is not with the group. They go back to Jerusalem and find him 3 days later in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And the text says this, "And all those who heard him were astonished at his understanding and his answers," not at his questions, at his understanding and his answers. The teachers of the temple were not indulging a precocious 12-year-old. They were, according to Luke, astonished by what he said. When his parents find him, and Mary expresses their distress, "Your father and I have been searching for you anxiously," Jesus responds with a sentence whose implication is rarely pressed as hard as it deserves to be. "Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Or in an alternative translation that is equally well supported by the Greek, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" The phrase in Greek is literally, "the things of my Father," and the point of the sentence is not its content but its tone. This is not a child discovering something for the first time. This is a child for whom a particular identity and orientation is already settled. He is surprised that they do not already know this about him. The question he asks them presupposes that his direction, his purpose, his relationship with whatever he means by "my Father," all of this is already formed. He is 12 years old. He is from a village of 200 people. He has just held his own with the theological professionals of Jerusalem, and he is surprised that anyone would look for him anywhere else. The next line is the one that closes the door. "And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man." And then Luke chapter 3 begins, and Jesus is 30, and John is at the Jordan. Spinoza observes in the 7th chapter of the Tractatus that the fragments of a text which survive editorial attention are frequently the most revealing pieces in the entire document, precisely because someone made a judgment that they were preservable. The temple episode survived. Someone, somewhere in the process by which Luke's gospel was composed and transmitted, decided this could stay, which means that all the other stories of the formation years were evaluated by the same process and found not to be preservable, not forgotten, evaluated, and removed or never included. The next part of what this implies is uncomfortable for anyone who was taught to trust the canonical record simply because it is canonical. Consider what the four Gospels collectively require of Jesus. They require a man who arrives at the Jordan already in possession of a coherent theological vision, already capable of articulating a transformative interpretation of the law, already equipped to gather disciples who would follow him based on the force of his presence and teaching, already able to generate conflict with the Pharisees on specific and detailed points of religious interpretation. He arrives not as a student but as a teacher, not as someone in the process of formation, but as someone already formed. And this arrival, this sudden appearance of a fully realized religious figure, is presented by all four Gospels as requiring no explanation. He is simply there, complete. Now here is what the four Gospels against themselves reveal, which is the uncomfortable piece of the structural argument. Knowing this doesn't make the story smaller. It makes the question much harder to put down. Mark is the oldest Gospel. Scholars date it to approximately 68 to 70 of the Common Era. Mark has no infancy narrative. Jesus appears in chapter 1, adult at the Jordan, requesting baptism from John. There is no birth story, no childhood, no temple episode, no growing in wisdom and stature. Jesus simply arrives. Matthew, writing perhaps 10 to 15 years after Mark, adds an infancy narrative: the birth in Bethlehem, the wise men, the flight to Egypt, the slaughter of the innocents. But after the return from Egypt, Matthew says only, "And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene." And then Jesus appears at the Jordan. Luke, writing around the same period as Matthew and apparently drawing on some overlapping sources, has the most detailed infancy narrative and the unique temple episode at 12. But then he too falls silent for 18 years. John, writing latest of all perhaps around 90 to 100 of the Common Era, dispenses with history entirely in favor of cosmic theology. Jesus is the eternal Word made flesh. His formation is not a human question, because his origin is not a human origin. 4 authors, 4 increasingly elaborate theologies of origin, and all 4 with the same result: no account of the years of formation. This is not a coincidence of sources. This is a pattern of editorial decision. And the decision to follow Spinoza's method reflects the shared agenda of the editorial process. Let me tell you about a conversation I have carried with me for 30 years. It was at a New Testament Studies conference in the north of England, somewhere in the mid-1990s. The kind of conference that happens in a converted educational building that is not quite warm enough, where the carpet in the corridors is the particular shade of green that institutional buildings in the north of England have always favored, and where the tea is served in thin plastic cups that conduct the heat directly to your fingers before you have had a chance to drink any. I was between sessions, standing in one of those corridors under the strip lighting that makes everyone look slightly ill, holding my plastic cup, watching people drift from one room to another. A specialist in the Synoptic Gospels stopped near me, a woman from Cambridge, someone whose work on source criticism I had read carefully, not a name I will give, but a scholar whose judgment I trusted. We had spoken briefly at previous conferences. She asked what I was thinking about, the way academics sometimes do in corridor moments between sessions, genuinely curious, not making conversation. I mentioned what had been in my mind since that night in Norwich, the editorial asymmetry, the way Mark begins at the Jordan. Matthew and Luke add nativities but skip the formation years. Luke preserves the temple episode but then nothing. John bypasses the human developmental arc entirely. I said it was the shared omission that troubled me, not what any individual author chose to exclude, but what all of them chose to exclude. She looked at me for a moment. Outside, through a window at the end of the corridor, the northern light was doing what northern light does, making the world look simultaneously clear and flat, like a document that has been photocopied one too many times. Then she said something that I've thought about in more contexts than just this one. She said, "The question is not what they forgot to include, it is what they all agreed not to include." And she went to get more tea. I stood in that corridor for a long time. The noise of the conference moved around me. People laughed in other rooms. Doors opened and closed. The strip lighting made its small, constant hum. And that sentence sat in the air, where she had left it, with the particular weight of sentences that are precise without being complete. What they all agreed not to include. This is the structural argument that Spinoza reaches in the Tractatus, not about the Gospels specifically, but about the nature of canonical text as a category. He was working with the Hebrew scriptures primarily when he wrote those chapters, but the method applies with equal force to the New Testament. A canon is not a collection of everything that was written about a subject. It is a selection from everything that was written, made by specific people in a specific institutional context for specific purposes. The Council of Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era is the most famous moment of that selection process, but it was not the first or the only one. By the time the 4 Gospels were circulating in the form we now have them, generations of transmission, copying, editing, and selection had already shaped what was in them and what was not. The question Spinoza would ask of the editorial process that produced the 4 canonical Gospels is the question he asks of every text. Who wrote it? For whom? With what interest? At what moment in the political and theological life of the institution? And then, following immediately, what was not written, by whom, with what interest? A Jesus with documented formation is a particular kind of problem for a particular kind of theology. If Jesus spent years in an Essene community, learning a specific tradition of scriptural interpretation, internalizing the vocabulary of purity and renewal that 1QS encodes, developing his understanding of the relationship between the human person and the divine within a structured sectarian context, then he is a man of his time and his tradition. He is someone whose remarkable capacities can be partially explained by his formation. He belongs to a genealogy of influence, a chain of transmission, a specific historical and cultural moment. He is, in this reading, deeply and specifically human, shaped by the tradition that shaped John, that shaped the communities of the Qumran region, that shaped a particular strand of Second Temple Judaism that was itself marginal and contested within the broader Jewish world of the first century. This is not a smaller Jesus, but it is a different Jesus from the one that the theology of incarnation, as it was systematized in the 4th century, as it was fixed at Nicaea in 325, as it was codified in the Nicene Creed and in the Chalcedonian definition of 451, requires. The Nicene Christ is fully divine and fully human, but his divinity is eternal and his human nature is assumed, not developed. He does not become the Christ through a process. He is the Christ from before time. Any account of a developmental process of formation, years spent learning from other teachers, years in which the young Jesus of Nazareth was becoming rather than simply being, complicates that theology at its foundation. It raises the question that the theology cannot comfortably answer. At what point in the formation process did the fully divine nature assert itself? And if it was always there, fully present from the moment of birth or conception, then why was formation needed at all? This is not a question that can be answered from inside the Nicene framework without considerable difficulty. And it is precisely the kind of question that an account of Jesus' missing years would make unavoidable. The gap is not ignorance, the gap is management. Someone decided, not in a single dramatic act of suppression, but through the accumulated weight of editorial decisions made over several generations, that the years of formation were less important to preserve than the theology of origin, and the decision protected something. It protected a particular account of who Jesus was that the institutional theology of the 4th century required. Spinoza is clear about what this means, and his clarity was the thing that made his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable. He did not argue that the gospel writers were lying. He argued that they were doing what every author does, writing for a purpose, within a tradition, with an agenda that is not necessarily dishonest but is always specific. The 4 evangelists were not transcriptionists. They were theologians. They selected, they emphasized, they arranged. And in their collective arrangement, 18 years of a life were judged to be less essential to the story they needed to tell than the swaddling clothes in Bethlehem and the theological prologue from before time. What we are left with is this: 18 years of silence. A child of 12 who demonstrates formation that his village could not have provided. A movement, the Baptists' movement, and then Jesus' movement, whose language, whose concepts, whose fundamental categories of purity and renewal and the coming of the kingdom bear deep structural resemblance to the literature of a community that required 3 years of formation to produce members of that kind. 4 authors who, with different tools and different literary strategies, all arrived at the same editorial result. No account of the formation years. A theology, fixed in the 4th century, that required a particular kind of origin story. One incompatible with a documented process of formation in a specific human tradition. And Spinoza's method, applied to the gap, the shared omission, is the argument, not an oversight, an agreement. I am not telling you that Jesus went to Tibet. That story was fabricated in 1894, demolished by 1895, and has been circulating on the strength of a genuine need for a century and 30 years. I am not telling you that Jesus was an Essene. I am telling you that the Essene hypothesis, Jesus spending part of his 18 missing years in the kind of structured formation that the Qumran community documents describe, perhaps connected to the network that produced John the Baptist, is the most historically coherent explanation available for a set of facts that the canonical texts do not explain. It requires no invented manuscripts. It requires no Himalayan journey. It requires only that you take seriously the geographical, linguistic, and sociological evidence that already exists in the documents we have. What Spinoza would want you to notice is something more fundamental than any specific theory about where Jesus went. He would want you to notice the gap itself, its shape, its size, its perfect alignment with a theological agenda that had very good reasons to require a Jesus who simply was what he was, without documented process, without traceable genealogy of influence, without the kind of human formation that would make him explicable within the tradition that shaped him. He would want you to notice that the gap is the same shape in all four Gospels, despite the fact that those four Gospels agree on very little else. Matthew and Mark disagree on the infancy. John disagrees with all three synoptics on the chronology of the ministry, but on the missing 18 years, they are unanimous. And unanimity of that kind in texts that disagree on so much else is not natural. It is achieved. I have spent 30 years thinking about this question in various forms. I have read the arguments for the Nazareth explanation, and I have found them inadequate to the textual evidence. I have read the Tibet manuscripts hypothesis, and I have found it historically worthless while finding the need it addresses genuinely significant. I have read the Essene hypothesis, and I have found it the most historically serious framework available, and I have read Spinoza, who would have said that none of these conclusions is the point. The point is the question itself, the act of asking where he was, and why no one wrote it down, and who benefited from the silence. Knowing this does not make the story smaller. It makes it considerably harder to put down. Because once you have seen the gap, once you have sat with Luke chapter 2 and Luke chapter 3 simultaneously open, with the 18 silent years between them, and asked not what the tradition says about that silence, but what the silence itself says, you cannot read the Gospels the same way again. Not because the faith they carry is undermined, but because the faith they carry was entrusted to documents written by human beings with human purposes. And those human beings made choices. The choices are in the text. The gap is in the text. The question is whether you are willing to read what the text is actually doing, rather than what you were taught to expect it to do. Spinoza would have said that this is the beginning of genuine engagement with any text, not the end of something. The beginning. You learn to read the gap. You learn to ask what was agreed not to include. And then the document, whatever document it is, however ancient, however authoritative, however central to the formation of your own understanding, begins to speak in a register that is more honest, more human, and ultimately more illuminating than the flattened authoritative surface it is usually presented as having. Where was he? Between 12 and 30, between the boy answering the temple doctors and the man walking into the Jordan. The answer is not in Ladakh. It is not, most probably, in Nazareth alone. It is, most probably, somewhere in the complex and vital world of Second Temple Judaism, in the networks of learning and formation that the Qumran documents attest, in the overlapping circles of a sectarian movement that produced both John and the tradition that Jesus would transform. That is the historically serious answer. Not dramatic, not exotic, but consequential. Consequential because it places Jesus inside the human history that shaped him, rather than above it. And placing him inside that history is what both the canonical silence and the institutional theology built upon it were designed to prevent. The question is what they all agreed not to include. I'm still standing in that corridor 30 years on, with the strip lighting overhead and the northern light through the window at the end. And that sentence still has the same weight it had the first time I heard it. Not because it resolves anything, because it identifies the thing that needs to be resolved. And the things that need to be resolved are always more important than the things that have been resolved too quickly, by people with reasons of their own for wanting the question to stop. Take care of yourselves.
What I shared today, it took me years to accept. Tell me in the comments if this changed something for you. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's still the truth.